Today, a company whose logo looms large over the Jacksonville skyline is accused of denying home ownership to the city's black and brown residents. Ameris Bank agreed to pay $9 million to resolve allegations by the Department of Justice that it engaged in a pattern or practice of redlining in communities of color. Redlining is an illegal practice in which lenders systematically deny credit based on race or ethnicity, hindering home ownership and the financial benefits that can accrue from it. I'm joined today by two people who have themselves accrued a wealth of knowledge about the issue of redlining and its impact on Jacksonville residents. Warren Jones, a former city council president and current school board member, as well as a lifelong resident of Jacksonville. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here. And congratulations to you on your new job.
Thank you so much. I'm having fun. We're at day 3, so
Okay.
hold on. I also welcome PeDro Cohen. He's the president of the Jacksonville branch of Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC, which is the largest community development organization in the country. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Jones. You grew up in the Mixontown area, which, for those who don't know, is located west of 95 and kind of sandwiched between I-10 and Beaver Street. What was the neighborhood like when you grew up there, and what is it like today?
Well, certainly redlining had an impact on that neighborhood. Many people who lived in Mixontown could not get the kinds of financial support they needed to maintain or improve their properties. And as a result, you have people who end up trying to find a shortcut. You don't get a permit because you don't have financing, so you get a friend to do part of the work, and then it takes forever. And many homes in that neighborhood are partially renovated. Many are boarded up even today. So the vestiges of redlining still exist in our older neighborhoods to this day.
Did you know what redlining was when you lived in that area, or was it known as something else?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't aware of it. In fact, I was reflecting on my parents when we moved from La Villa in downtown and purchased our first home in North Riverside on Stockton Street, which is on the fringe of what we call Mixontown. I noticed in reviewing their mortgage that they had a first mortgage and a second mortgage. So obviously, and the interest rate for 1959 was quite high, I thought, and I wondered why they didn't get a first mortgage. But the neighborhood probably was redlined, and they could not get the kind of financing. Most time when you purchase a home, you get one mortgage, and in their case, they did not.
Interesting. PeDro Cohen, what is the practical effect of redlining?
The practical effect is the lack of investment in those very same communities. You don't see a lot of economic investment. You don't see a lot of infrastructure investment. So you see that happen over time, and that compiles. And so we are living through the results of redlining today.
And so there's financial impacts for families and also for institutions or schools, infrastructure. Talk about that financial impact.
The financial impact is that when you don't have investment in those communities, businesses don't come to those communities. And so you see now in most redline communities, they're also in 2023, they are also food deserts. They are also, for the most part, financial deserts. They are also, for the most part, medical deserts. So the impact that redlining has far exceeds just not being able to get a loan in those communities.
What is interesting about Jacksonville is I think it was the first city ever to create a zoning map in the 1930s. And that actually predates the formal induction or introduction of redlining. But the map that they created, that zoning map, resembled the maps that were to come in the redlining era, and they were designated areas on that original zoning map. They were designated restricted and unrestricted / industrial. And that unrestricted zoning, there was no limits on the kind of development that could occur, and they were mostly black and brown communities. So talk about how that initial zoning map overlay, kind of created these more permanent structures of redlining.
Well, certainly has a major impact, and you see it today in many of our minority neighborhoods where they're impacted by industry. You have homes built right next to railroad track in some areas of Newtown. You have in the Mixontown area, you had homes that were surrounded by a garbage incinerator. You had the dog pound, which is now called the Animal Care and Control Center. You had schools placed in those neighborhoods for black kids to go to. So the redlining has tremendous. And then what we also learn is there's a thing called reverse redlining, where they'll give you the loan, but they'll charge you a higher interest rate. So you end up being in more debt than the average person because you have higher interest rate. It takes longer to repay the loan. So you get someone who is not licensed to do the work, and the quality is not there, and then oftentimes you pay twice for it. So it has tremendous impacts, and the zoning certainly still plays a role, and you see the fight that the people in Gulffair are having today over the medical examiner's office. The zoning was already there. They didn't realize that the zoning permitted it. So we have to begin to educate and understand you can't look at a property and determine the zoning. You have to look at the maps to decide what the zoning is.
I'm sorry, go ahead, PeDro.
And one of the things to kind of piggyback on what Mr. Jones said was that those very same communities have the highest rates of heirs property in our entire city. And so when you look at properties that literally can't be proven ownership or ownership is in question, the highest portion of those also exist in formerly redline communities.
And why is that? What's the connection between not having like a designated heir for your property and the redlining legacy?
Well, again, it's how do you that's wealth that leaves out of those very same communities, and we are intentional as an agency through LISC of addressing that issue. In Duval County alone, you have about 12,000 probable cases of heirs property in those very same communities in zip codes 32206, 32208, 32209, and a few others. You have about 2,700 cases of probable heirs property. And economically, what that represents is well over $165 million in terms of debt equity that those residents do not have access to. In the city of Jacksonville, that number is probably closer to $2 billion in terms of debt equity that residents do not have access to. And when you have that level of capital that residents in those neighborhoods cannot put their hands on because they can't prove ownership, that's problematic. And so we are working really, really close with the United Way, the city of Jacksonville, and JP Morgan Chase to really address those issues, particularly in formerly redline communities.
We want you to join the conversation. Give us a call at 549-2937. Tag us on X at FCC On Air, or send an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also message us on the First Coast Connect Facebook and Instagram pages. We have a call from a gentleman who I believe used to work as an executive at a bank. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Good morning. I am a lady. My name is L.J. Holloway.
My apologies.
And I am, it's okay. I am a fourth-generation Jacksonvillian, but I am also a former executive at a bank. And let me just say that redlining is very pervasive today. We know that discrimination in housing, in particular with black and brown borrowers, is systemic. We see it in the fees, and as Mr. Jones alluded to, how his parents had, a first and a second mortgage, you see it all the time. I spent many of my days fighting with underwriting regarding the kinds of hoops that black and brown borrowers have to go through. Redlining is very present today, and while you mentioned Ameris Bank $9 million fine, look, there are a number of banks who continuously practice the same types of banking. And so what we have to do is educate John Q. Public or Mr. or Mrs. Borrower on the types of fees that are subjective so that people can get fair borrowing, because clearly there is not a regulatory agency that is enforcing at the scale to to deter banks from discriminating against borrowers, because $9 million is not a lot of money when you talk about the millions or the billions of dollars that banks receive in fees when they're lending to Black and brown borrowers.
Thank you, Ms. Holloway, for your comments. I appreciate it. PeDro, what do you say about that? I mean, obviously, we started this conversation talking about Ameris Bank, and we'll get more into that in a little bit. But she's saying this is much more widespread than just that.
I think, again, it's a problem when you look across the board. The issue of redlining not only compounds itself, but has, spin-offs to that. And that is in the issues of appraisals. When you look at the value of homes in those very same communities, the growth rate in terms of Black and brown communities, that's pretty much flatlined. You don't see that as an ascending value. And the challenge we face now is that you're competing against institutional investors who are coming into those communities and buying those homes up for pennies on the dollar, and then turn around and rent them for $1,200, $1,500 a month. And so now you have institutional investors that you're competing against in formerly redline communities where people cannot get mortgages on their properties. And so we just have to make this an intentional process that we are willing to address as a community.
And to follow up on that, I've always said that it takes the private sector and the public sector to correct those ills. It's not going to happen overnight, but it takes all of us, because you see boarded up houses. You see what they call now liquor lining, where these liquor stores are popping up all in these neighborhoods that don't have the time, as Dr. Cohen said, I forget, he has his doctorate now. Dr. Cohen has said that you lose all the amenities that a neighborhood is used to. So people who grew up in those neighborhoods who have done well, they don't go back there because they don't have the services that you need. The restaurants, the retail sales, those are missing in those neighborhoods. So it further adds to the depreciation of those neighborhoods.
And there's a inverse relationship between, investment and, public dollar investment. And so when you don't see the infrastructure investment, you don't see the economic investment on the part of business and industry. And so there's an inverse relationship there that exists. And in those very same communities that we're talking about, what you see is a lot of social programming and social investment, but you don't see the economic investment there. You have to have both in order to have thriving communities. It's not by chance that those communities that were formerly redline are also the same communities that have the highest rates of crime, have the highest rate of infant mortality, have the lowest educational attainment. It's because we have not invested in those. And so what we have to do is we have to look at situations like this and try to figure out, how do we address the issue? Because you cannot have one and don't have the other.
And I think, to your point, there is an element of environmental justice to this, right? I think
absolutely.
You've referenced previously, like part of that zoning, I think near where you grew up, there was a slaughterhouse.
Right. Yeah, and they place schools in those neighborhoods, and that's something we have to recognize was a reality. You had neighborhoods growing up, Black neighborhoods, locating in areas where you had a slaughterhouse. You had a chicken place that they slaughtered chickens. You had a garbage incinerator. All that in those neighborhoods, thanks to the Delaney administration, they allocated $95 million to help clean up the ash contamination in the Mixontown neighborhood. But the infrastructure, the public infrastructure, has not been improved. You go to Newtown, for example, where David Hicks and Wayne Weaver committed $1 million to help have Jacksonville homes. But yet you have vacant homes next to Dr. Cohen's point. They don't know how, they can't pass that home on to anybody because it's still caught up in a probate situation. So people have to learn that system, and we have to, as a city, provide the infrastructure. You got a nice new Haverjacks home next to a boarded up home with no curb and gutters, no sidewalks. So that also impacts. So it takes all of us. That $8 million or $9 million that Ameris Bank has committed, will help, but it's just a start, just a drop in the bucket.
It's important, I think, to remember when you talk about home ownership, it's not just are you able to get a loan to buy a home, but if you own a home in those neighborhoods and people can't get loans,
To maintain.
you really can't sell your home.
Right. And that's why we are addressing the issue of heirs property in those very same neighborhoods. You take an issue like in North Riverside. North Riverside is one of the hottest neighborhoods in terms of buying property in our community because of this proximity to the Emerald Trail. Well, many of those people won't be able to sell those homes because they can't prove ownership. And so we've made it our business to address the issue in heirs property in some of our most challenged communities throughout our city, just so that people have the option to realize the economic benefit of home ownership. And so that's very intentional on our part, but we're just one entity. And that level of intentionality has to spread throughout our entire city. Communities didn't get this way overnight. And we have to, again, make sure we are about the business of providing opportunities so that we can say we are who we really say we are.
And also, going to your point earlier about the zoning, in many cases, we have to revisit the zoning in those neighborhoods to make sure that the zoning will allow them to rebuild. We found in some neighborhoods that they had homes on it, but because of what happened prior to consolidation, when there were no blacks on the city council, the zoning was dictated by the business community. And so you had a whole community we found in North Riverside that was zoned for industrial, but it had all homes on it. And they just assumed, and then they couldn't make any major improvements to their home because they couldn't get they were not zoned residential.
That's wild.
Yeah.
We've got Anthony here online, too. He wants to make a comment about an upcoming town hall meeting. Good morning, Anthony.
Good morning. Good morning. How's everyone doing?
Terrific.
Good, thank you.
Yes, we have formed an organization that deals with the legacy of redlining here in Jacksonville, Florida, as well as the unfulfilled promises of consolidation. The purpose of the organization is to form an alliance with organizations and folks who disseminate information on some of the ills, if you will, of what redlining has caused and the byproduct of that. We work closely with a Lydia Bell, who has been on the front lines of the Go Fair issue with the morgue and the liquor store and everything they've been doing. She's been relatively successful with pushing back with the liquor store, but we're still having issues. We are having a town hall, and we've been having a series of town hall meetings dealing with these issues, as well as Fairfax, as well as other debilitating issues and or redlining policies in our community. Has been going on since the 30s, believe it or not. And we would like to talk to the audience, or at least send out our invitation for our town hall that will be 1405 State Street at 6 o'clock, November 8th, which is this upcoming Wednesday. In this meeting, we're talking about civic engagement. One of the reasons why we feel like the issue is we don't have enough awareness is we don't have enough civic engagement, too.
So the
we
8th
need the
of
community.
November at 6 o'clock, is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you, Anthony, so much.
1405 State Street.
Say that one more time.
Thank you. Yes, 1405 State Street.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So there is this issue. I know the neighborhoods, like you said, the I can't remember what you called it, where liquor stores are proliferating. There is
It's called liquor lining now.
Liquor
Instead
lining.
of redlining, they're liquor lining some of these older neighborhoods, and neighbors are pushing back. We opposed one on Sutel because it was within 1,000 feet of one of our schools, and we were successful, but it took a lot of work and a lot of time because the applicant had the zoning, but because he was so close to a church, then he had to get an exception, and that church allowed us to fight back and push against it.
I want to talk a little bit specifically about the Ameris Bank issue and the settlement that was announced a couple weeks ago by the Department of Justice. Now, we should note that the bank denies that it violated fair lending laws and says that it reached the $9 million settlement simply to avoid extended and costly litigation. And their statement in part said that they strongly disagree with any suggestion that they've engaged in discriminatory conduct, and they cooperated fully with the inquiry. But the allegations were eye-opening. The Department of Justice said that between 2016 and 2021, Ameris Bank avoided providing mortgage services to majority Black and Hispanic neighborhoods in Jacksonville and discouraged people seeking credit in those communities from getting loans. It said that although the bank operates 18 branches in Jacksonville, it never opened or operated a branch in a majority Black or Hispanic neighborhood in the city. And I believe it had one bank north of the St. Johns River, but had closed it or shuttered it. So what does the impact of a large lender, and again, like I said earlier, on our city skyline, what is the implication? They say they didn't violate the law, but they have agreed to this settlement. How does that impact the community to know that this redlining was?
I think for me, it just creates an opportunity. It creates an opportunity not only for dialogue, but it creates an opportunity to address whatever they're being charged with. And so I rather look at it in that light rather than to look at what was done. I have no information to suggest to me that something happened. So therefore, what I want to do is, you've decided to pay this amount of money to address the issue. How do we sit down at a table and redress that to make whatever wrong right? For me, that's number one. And then I think number two, I think we have to look at the collective whole. I mean, if you live in the Newtown community, you are in a financial desert. I mean, there isn't a bank. If you live on Kings Road, in any proximity to residents in that neighborhood. And so, I think that's a larger issue, to address. But again, I think the Ameris situation represents an opportunity for us to have some dialogue and approach the solution with a level of intentionality about how do we make this wrong or right.
So the settlement provides for $7.5 million in loan subsidy fund that will be made available to residents of majority Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And then there's some additional money for advertising and outreach. How would you like to see that money made available? How will the community be notified, of that money resource?
I think Dr. Cohen makes a good point. I think partnering with nonprofits that are actively working in those neighborhoods would be a good start. There are organizations like LISC. There are organizations like
Wealth Watchers,
Habajacks. There are a number of groups working in those neighborhoods. That's where you can make the most impact, I believe, and working not just with Ameris Bank, but all the other banks who have, by benign neglect, neglected those neighborhoods. And I think that's why, and then get the city involved and say, well, we're going to invest in these neighborhoods, but we need you to step up and improve the infrastructure. We need the school district. We are now building 26 replacement schools. We're making substantial investments in these neighborhoods, trying to bring quality buildings so our students can better perform. But the neighborhoods around there need to be improved too, so that we can continue to grow our enrollment. And that has to happen too.
I think we have a question from Lee on line one. Good morning, Lee. What's your question?
Good morning. I just wanted to find out if there has ever been any studies as to the equality or inequality of infrastructure, such as drainage or fire hydrants in these areas.
Thanks. Thank you.
Warren, I know you probably can take this, but one thing you will learn as you sort of get your sea legs under you about Jacksonville, we have a notorious reputation for studies. So there's, I'm sure there is a study that's been done 3 or 4 times relative to Lee's question about infrastructure in the city of Jacksonville, particularly in our under-resourced neighborhoods. But,
he's absolutely right. There are stacks. When I took office in '79, the first thing I told Mayor Garbo, I need money for drainage. He said, we need a study done. So I said, he said, what does it cost? I said, I don't know. He said, well, we need to have a study. Well, we got the money for the study, and we found we didn't have any money to implement the study. And so it took us probably 10 years, if not more, to complete the drainage for Grand Park, for example. We found out in that case, going back to his point, is that there were very few fire hydrants in that neighborhood, surprisingly. And I said, wow, I'm surprised. You got a fire station in the neighborhood, but you don't have the fire hydrants. So when they redid the drainage in that neighborhood, put in and got rid of the open ditches, put in curb and gutters, put in some retention ponds, they put in probably 5 or 6 fire hydrants, which drove the homeowners insurance down because they're closer to a fire hydrant.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, if you don't have enough fire hydrants in your neighborhood, your insurance rates go up.
That's correct.
So it's kind of a different financial impact.
Yeah.
You know, some of this redlining issue, I mean, redlining was outlawed, and it had been baked into federal law when it came to mortgage lending. Is it surprising to see that it continues, or at least allegations of it continue?
Well, I sold real estate for probably 20 some odd years, and it was always interesting to me that even though the state of Florida had settled with housing discrimination, because it was so persistent in the state of Florida, to this day in 2023, the settlement still says you have to have at least 4 questions on your renewal exam dealing with housing discrimination. So housing discrimination coupled with redlining, coupled with past efforts to zone property so that it's not suitable for residential use, coupled with all of that means that we have a lot of work to do in this community.
And again, I still think that redlining is just, the tip of the iceberg. If you do not look at how we are appraising true value for homes in these areas, then we still have a problem there. So the issue of appraisal bias has to be a part of the larger conversation, because it's one thing to say, yeah, I'll loan money on a house and the house is being sold for, well past the appraised value. So now, where does that resident get the additional cash to be able to buy a home, particularly in our most challenged neighborhoods who, don't see the adequate appraisal for homes? There are 2 homes, just now that I'm thinking about it, that are 4 miles apart. And the difference between the value of the same house built by the same builder, designed the same way, is $200,000.
Wow.
And it's four miles apart. And so if a bank steps in and says, hey, we'll loan you the money, where does that buyer and or that builder get the resources to fill that gap? So we have to look at the entire system. And again, I say that, redlining is just a part of that, but there are downstream implications that redlining it has an impact on.
Well, PeDro Cohen of LISC, Warren Jones, a longtime resident school board member. Thank you both so much for being here and talking about this important issue today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day. And
You too.
Good luck to you
again.
again.
Thank you.